Hi guys, because we didn't get to make it through the pancreas and gonads slides, I'm just going to briefly go over the hormones that they make. We talked a little bit about the anatomy of the pancreas in class, but let me just review this as well. So the pancreas is located slightly below the stomach. So here you can see the stomach. Highlighted in blue is the pancreas. So it's slightly below the stomach and it's behind the beginning of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum. And here you can see the stomach removed and the pancreas is highlighted in pink. Here's the duodenum. The pancreas is considered both an exocrine and an endocrine organ. So it has exocrine cells that secrete digestive enzymes into the small intestine. And you can actually see that right here. So remember, an exocrine gland is one that releases chemicals through a duct. And you can actually see that there is this duct here that allows digestive enzymes to enter the lumen, or in other words, the space within the small intestine. The pancreas also has tiny clusters of cells called pancreatic islets that are considered endocrine cells. And so here you can see some exocrine cells in the dark purple, and in the middle you can see this cluster of cells that look a little bit different. They're a lot lighter, and these are the pancreatic islets. And in these pancreatic islets are cells that secrete hormones into the blood. Here you could see highlighted in blue all the little islets scattered throughout the tissue of the pancreas. And here is one zoomed in. All hormones that are produced in the pancreas are produced in cells of the pancreatic islets. There are three main cells in the pancreatic islets. These include the beta cells, alpha cells, and delta cells. The alpha cells produce the hormone glucagon. Glucagon is really important because when it is released, it increases blood glucose levels. This typically happens between meals because between meals you don't have a constant source of glucose intake. So therefore, in order to maintain your blood glucose levels, your pancreas releases glucagon, and what glucagon does is glucagon converts glycogen into glucose and releases it into the blood. The beta cells produce the hormone insulin, and insulin lowers blood glucose levels. This is going to be really important during or immediately after a meal, because when you're eating a meal or immediately after you eat a meal, your blood glucose levels rise really, really high. And so your body needs to lower those glucose levels and it releases insulin. The way that insulin works is that it actually signals the cells in your body to take up that glucose and use it for energy. Or it might cause them to take up the glucose and store that glucose in the form of glycogen. There are many clinical applications associated with insulin, and one that you're probably most familiar with is diabetes. Genetic defects can actually lead to type 1 diabetes, and in type 1 diabetes, the beta cells actually produce too little insulin or may not even produce any insulin at all. There is a third hormone produced by the pancreas, and this is from the delta cells. When you think of somatostatin, I just want you to think of it as a major inhibitory hormone. There are a couple different endocrine cells that produce somatostatin, and it may have different effects depending on the type of gland that's producing it. In the case of the pancreas, somatostatin, when it's released, inhibits glucagon and insulin secretion. And this would happen whenever maybe you have a level source of glucose in your blood, and you might not need it to increase or decrease. So somatostatin may then be released. You should know the differences between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So what exactly is diabetes? Well, technically diabetes is usually called diabetes mellitus, and it's characterized by excess glucose in the blood and also in the urine. So usually it's diagnosed by looking to see if there's glucose in the urine. There shouldn't really be any glucose in the urine in a healthy person, but if you're diabetic, you'll have really high levels of glucose being excreted during urination. There's two main causes of diabetes. One is hyposecretion of insulin, so your body isn't producing enough insulin, or it could also be caused by an inaction of insulin, so your cells are not responding to insulin. Diabetes is the most prevalent metabolic disease in the United States. It affects 7 to 9% of the US population. So that's approximately 30 million people in the United States that have diabetes. And 1 in 4 of those individuals usually don't even realize that they're diabetic. So I did decide to add this little table differentiating type 1 and type 2 diabetes. This is something I was going to talk about in class, but since I'm making this video, I thought I'd just put it together as a table. I did upload this slide onto Canvas, so if you do want to go on and print it off, feel free to do that, or you could just write down a couple notes. Before we talk about what causes diabetes, let's look at what happens in a healthy individual. In a healthy individual, the pancreas will produce insulin. Insulin will then travel throughout the body, and it will bind to insulin receptors present on pretty much every cell in your body. When insulin binds to an insulin receptor, it signals that cell to take in glucose, and therefore that glucose can be used for energy within that cell. However, problems can happen in this process if somebody has diabetes. There are two main types of diabetes, type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. There is also a third type of diabetes called gestational diabetes, which develops in women that are pregnant. However, we'll talk about that later in this semester, and in this chapter, we're only going to really talk about the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is much rarer than type 2 diabetes. Only about 5% of diabetics have type 1 diabetes. It's typically diagnosed in children, teens, and young adults, and the cause of it is usually some type of genetic defect. Therefore, type 1 diabetes is hereditary and unpreventable. The genetic defect that individuals have usually causes an autoimmune reaction. Autoimmune reactions occur because the immune system actually starts attacking normal cells within your body. And in this case, the cells that it's attacking are the beta cells in the pancreas. So this autoimmune reaction damages beta cells in the pancreas, and this causes the pancreas to not produce insulin. So therefore, to summarize the cause of type 1 diabetes, the pancreas fails to produce insulin. And you can see that over here in the diagram. There's no insulin coming from the pancreas to bind to the receptors on the cells. So how can type 1 diabetes be treated? Well, there's currently no cure for this disease. However, insulin injections can be given every day for the individual's entire life in order to regulate their blood glucose levels. Type 2 diabetes, on the other hand, is much more common. About 90% of individuals with diabetes have type 2 diabetes. It's usually diagnosed in adults, but one of the problems happening recently is that it's becoming more and more common in children. It's caused usually by obesity, lack of exercise, unhealthy diet, or some medications that can complicate the interactions between insulin and the cells in your body. What happens whenever somebody's maybe eating in a healthy diet or not exercising enough is that the cells become insulin resistant and they stop responding to insulin. So if somebody has insulin resistance, their pancreas is producing plenty of insulin. However, it's not binding to the insulin receptors, or the insulin receptors are not really responding to it appropriately. And since the insulin receptors are not responding to insulin correctly, glucose is not taken into the cells. What are the treatments for type 2 diabetes? One of them is lifestyle changes. So making lifestyle changes that can reduce the amount of carbohydrates you're taking in, that can reduce potentially the amount of fat in your body, can actually lower the symptoms of type 2 diabetes and may actually reverse the whole problem. Also, there are some medications that individuals can take to make them more sensitive to insulin. Now let's talk about the gonads, the ovaries and the testes. We'll first look at the anatomy of the ovaries. The ovaries are a pair of reproductive organs that produce eggs, also called the ova or oocyte. The ovaries are located on either side of the pelvic region. They contain many follicles that each month will form a mature egg. So only one of those follicles produces a mature egg. And here you can actually see a follicle, which is this cluster of cells here. And in the middle, you can see an egg developing. Each month, one follicle fully matures and releases an egg into the uterus. And that is called ovulation. When ovulation occurs, the follicle will degenerate and just form this mass of cells called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is responsible for producing progesterone, which helps to sustain pregnancy. Both the cells of the follicles and the cells in the corpus luteum produce hormones within the ovaries. The cells of the follicles produce a type of estrogen called estradiol, and the cells of the corpus luteum produce a hormone called progesterone. These hormones are really important for developing the secondary female characteristics that develop during puberty. This includes enlarged breasts, includes the distribution of fat and the widening of the hips. These hormones also regulate the menstrual cycle, and they help to sustain pregnancy. The ovaries also produce another hormone called inhibin. Inhibin suppresses follicle-stimulating hormone release from the anterior pituitary after ovulation. This makes sense because right after you ovulate, you don't want your follicles to continue developing and maturing a new egg. So you would want to inhibit that. If we look at the anatomy of the testes, here you can see the testes are also paired. And if you were to look inside the testes, you would see a whole bunch of tiny little tubes called seminiferous tubules. And that is where sperm is produced. If you took a little slice of the testes and looked at it under the microscope, you would cut through these tubules, and inside you could see many sperm developing. The testes produce two main types of hormones. The one type of hormone is a sex steroid called testosterone. Testosterone controls primary male characteristics, so this includes the testes during fetal development. And it produces secondary male characteristics which occur during puberty, including enlarged muscles, a deepening of the voice, as well as the growth of hair on the body. Testosterone is also important in promoting sex drive and sustaining sperm production. Just like we saw in the ovaries, the testes also produce inhibin, and this suppresses FSH release from the anterior pituitary to regulate sperm production. So it inhibits sperm production when sperm production needs to be lowered. So the last two slides are just tables summarizing the major hormones produced by the endocrine glands other than the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. And let me just quickly read through these. The pineal gland produces melatonin, which regulates sleep and wakefulness. It synchronizes physiological functions with our circadian rhythms, which is our biological 24-hour internal clock. The thymus produces thymosin, which stimulates the production of T cells, which are a type of immune cell. This is easy to remember. Just think T, T, T. The thyroid glands, this is really important for regulating metabolism and also regulating calcium levels. The thyroid gland produces two thyroid hormones called T3 and T4, or triiodothyronine or thyroxine. They increase metabolic rate and increase heat production. Calcitonin is also released by the thyroid gland, and it decreases blood calcium levels. Located posterior to the thyroid gland is the parathyroid gland, which produces the parathyroid hormone. And this increases blood calcium levels. It has the opposite effect of calcitonin. The adrenal cortex produces three main groups of hormones: mineralocorticoids, I'm never going to be able to say that word, and glucocorticoids, and small traces of steroid sex hormones. The main mineralocorticoid is aldosterone, and it promotes water and salt retention. So you can think of it regulating minerals in your body, or salts. Glucocorticoids are stress hormones, and the most common one that you produce is called cortisol. It helps your body respond to stress, and this includes increasing protein and fat catabolism, or the catabolism means the breakdown. I always remember that catabolism means the breakdown of molecules because it sounds like catastrophe, something's being broken down. So cortisol increases protein and fat catabolism. It also synthesizes glucose from amino acids to provide an increase in glucose for energy. There are small traces of steroid sex hormones produced by the adrenal cortex. They promote growth in the male reproductive tract during fetal development, and it's also one of the main sources of estrogen during menopause in women. The adrenal medulla produces a group of hormones called catecholamines. This includes norepinephrine and epinephrine, and also just a trace amount of dopamine. The adrenal medulla increases alertness and prepares the body for activity, which we call the fight or flight response. It's important in prolonging the sympathetic nervous system response. The pancreas, as we went over, produces three main hormones, and its main function is to regulate glucose levels in the blood. Glucagon increases blood glucose levels between meals by converting glycogen to glucose. Insulin from the beta cells lowers blood glucose levels during or immediately after a meal. It signals cells to take up glucose from the blood. Somatostatin inhibits glucagon and insulin secretion. The ovaries produces estrogens, specifically estradiol and progesterone. These regulate secondary female characteristics, which again are those that you see that develop during puberty. It regulates the menstrual cycle, and it sustains pregnancy. It also produces the hormone inhibin, which inhibits egg production pretty much by suppressing FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone. So it suppresses the release of FSH from the anterior pituitary after ovulation occurs. The testes produces also two main groups of hormones: testosterone, which controls primary male characteristics during development as a fetus, and also controls secondary male characteristics. It also promotes sex drive and sustains sperm production. The testes produces another hormone called inhibin, which inhibits sperm production by suppressing FSH release from the anterior pituitary. All right, so that ends the endocrine chapter. You do want to know the major endocrine glands the hormones they produce and the effects of those hormones. So I recommend studying the tables that I posted in the PowerPoint and just looking over them, a little bit each day until the exam, and it will stick eventually. So I wish you the best of luck with studying those. If you have any questions, you can always send me an email.